So thank you, everyone. Let's get started. I'm Ken Cerini, Managing Partner of Cerini Associates. I have with me today Tania Quigley. Tanya's she's one of the partners here we both work within our nonprofit group. Also here answering a bunch of your questions, so feel free to post questions to the Q&A or to the chat as we're going through this. We'll try to answer some of them live, and then we have Matt Burke, who's also one of our nonprofit partners, who's going to be behind the scenes kind of answering the questions, and he's going to be doing part of the presentations for the next couple that we're going to be doing. This is a three-part series. So again, I want to thank everybody for participating in today's board training series. As I said, this is our first of three. Just to give you a little background on who we are, Cerini Associates is nearly a 70-person firm. We have two offices, one in Bohemia, one in Syosset. We do everything as an accounting firm. We're a full-service accounting firm. We have a for-profit part of our practice where we work with for-profit companies, and we have the nonprofit part of our practice, which is the more relevant part today, since we're going to be talking about board training and board development for nonprofit organizations. Nonprofits represent, between nonprofit and educational organizations, represent about 2/3 of our overall practice. That puts us per GuideStar as one of the top 10 firms in the New York metropolitan area. We work with approximately 300 nonprofit organizations. So again, we are well-versed in the nonprofit space, and we're here to be a resource to you. I think that's kind of what makes us a little different from other accounting firms, is that we're constantly concerned with how do we add value to the relationship? How do we continue to educate our clients and our friends and the nonprofit sector as a whole? We feel that's a very, very important part of our job. We've pushed out a lot of good information. If you go to our website, we have our nonprofit guide to effective board membership, which looks like this. We have an IT guide on there. We have a trends report we do every year. We have newsletters that go out. We do trainings on a monthly basis. We do an annual nonprofit training. So we have a lot of different things that are happening and a lot of good resources for our nonprofit, for the nonprofit sector. So we do encourage you to kind of hop on our website, get to know us a little bit better, stay connected. That's important for us. We want to be a resource to you throughout the year. So let's talk about what we're going to be talking about today. So again, it's a three-part series. Today is the first part. We have our second part on December 13th and our final part on January 19th. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about the nonprofit sector, what's going on in the sector. We're going to be talking about some of the board responsibilities, how to build a stronger board structure, things like that. And then we'll get more into some of the deeper dives in terms of strategic thinking and succession planning and managing risk and fiscal oversight and raising funds and all that stuff in our future topics. All right, so before we get started, we really can't talk about your role as a board member. We really can't talk about the nonprofit sector without first understanding some of the challenges that the nonprofit sector is facing today and some of the issues. So I want to spend a couple minutes really just doing a quick overview of what's happening within the nonprofit sector. So first of all, obviously, we had a whole pandemic that we've been sitting in for the last couple of years. The COVID pandemic really changed the dynamics of how nonprofits work. Nonprofits actually used to lag well behind from a technology perspective, and the pandemic has actually caught everybody up. The nonprofit sector is doing much better from a technology perspective. But what it also did is it kind of slowed down everything. It slowed down the economy, and it kind of threw the economy into a bit of a turmoil here. And we're dealing with increased inflation. We have the highest level of inflation we've had in over 40 years. So that's going to create some issues in terms of your budgets and everything else. It's going to cost more to do absolutely anything. We're seeing declining stock market, which is going to have an impact on your donors and maybe an impact on the collectability of some of the past pledges that were made. Staff shortages, unemployment is down to about 3.5%. And there was a study that was recently done where it showed that 63% of individuals living in New York City would prefer to move. So you have an exodus that's happening here from the New York City metropolitan area, and that's going to create additional shortages from a staffing perspective. We have, depending on which side of the spectrum you're on, on health and welfare-based organizations, you're seeing an increase in demand. People are living paycheck to paycheck. They don't have the resources they once had. So we're looking at a big increase in demand in an economy that's slumping. And if you're on the arts and cultural side, you're actually seeing demand shrinkage. You don't have the participation, the patrons that used to come to the events. Environmental and geopolitical concerns. I mean, we just had a major storm down in Florida. We have a war that's taking place, in Russia and Ukraine. We as people come together around, conflict. We come together around catastrophes that take place, and we want to support. We want to help. But what does that mean? It means that money that would have gone to local nonprofit organizations are not necessarily going to be coming to the local nonprofit organizations. We're going to see a lot more of that money traveling to help in some of these global issues that are taking place. We've become a much smaller world over time, and we definitely are in a situation where there's more dollars that are flowing from some of the local charities to some of these global type charities and incidents, because we truly want to help. I mean, that's who we are as people. So that's going to create some more hardship in terms of the economy. Stagflation or a recession, where are we going to be? I mean, I've heard news that, come next year, we're going to see, economic growth of only about 1%, which would put us in that stagflation type area. And we could fall into a recession. We heard that, or the economists have been saying that if we do fall into a recession, it won't be as deep or as bad as some of the past recessions we've fallen into, but we could be in a recessionary area next year. And we've seen some easing of supply chains, but how much are we going to see? Is that going to be prolonged? So we have some real issues here that we're dealing with, and that kind of, when you think about being a board member and you think about overseeing your nonprofit organization and providing proper governance and everything, part of your job as a board member is really understanding risk, and that's both internal and external factors, and how that is going to impact your organization, because you have a fiduciary responsibility to the overall oversight of the agency, and we'll talk about that more as we move through this presentation. So because you have that fiduciary responsibility, it's really important that you understand some of these factors and how these factors are going to impact your organization, and what do you need to do as board members to kind of address them. So we kind of give you some ideas here from an impact perspective. I mean, we need to reevaluate our budgets, right? I mean, we've established budgets at the end of last year if you're a December 31st year end, or sometime in April or May if you're a June 30th, whatever year it happens to be. And those budgets now may not be realistic anymore. I mean, we could be seeing, either increases in fee for service or demands for services, which impacts revenue, or decreases. You could be seeing increases in costs. Healthcare costs have skyrocketed. Some of the other costs are up. Salaries are up. Everybody is looking, with the shortages, looking to get paid a little bit more money. So you're in a situation where you have to rethink those budgets that have been created. If you do have some shortfalls within your budgets, what contingency plans have you put in place? And with next year, going to be potentially an off year, you're in a situation where you really should be, as you're going through your budget, you should be working up multiple budgets. What's my expected budget? And then what happens if I don't do as well? What happens if there's a 5% or 10% decline in operations because of different factors? Our contributions aren't as strong as they were because the economy's down, or we're not getting the units of service that we thought we were going to have. Let's say we're a school and we rely on tuition revenue and we have less students. All of these things are things that should be factored into a contingency budget, so that if there is a decline, you know what you're going to do, and some of that stuff is pre-established. Again, it's your job as the board to provide that proper oversight and guidance. Evaluate the effectiveness of programs. So again, if you have programs over the years, we see what's called mission creep. Programs grow, right? Programs, you kind of have your core mission, and then you take on, following the money, you take on operations that may fall slightly outside of your mission. So you're in a situation where you need to maybe reevaluate some of that money that was on some of these ancillary type activities may have dried up. and you might be losing money on these. It becomes much more important today than ever before in a down economy. In baseball, there's a saying, wins kind of cover everything. So if you're winning, if there's problems within the clubhouse, you don't really feel those problems within the clubhouse because you're winning. Same thing happens here. If you have a strong economy and a lot of money coming in, you could have inefficiencies within your operations. You could have inefficiencies within your model. It doesn't really matter because there's enough money there to cover it. But here we are in a situation where maybe if that money is shrinking and things are tightening, we really need to look at those inefficiencies and see if we can fix them. So if you have programs that are not really functioning effectively, you need to know about that and make an assessment of, are they core to our mission? Are they not core to our mission? Should we keep them? Should we get rid of them? If we get rid of them, what sort of linkage agreements should we set up with other nonprofits so that we continue to meet the needs of our constituents? Consider changing the way you work with staff. I mean, there's a whole push now towards a new gig economy where staff members, you may not be able to find full-time staff members, but maybe you can find staff members who do projects, and you might want to think of things from a project basis. So that's something to think about. Outsourcing services, another good idea to kind of explore and think about. Consider developing strategic business partnerships. And we'll talk about this more probably in our third presentation. But when we look at this and you kind of look at how fundraising works today, everything is, let's try to get sponsors, let's run events, let's do this. But there might be better ways to do things through strategic partners, working more closely with your business partners instead of just asking them to be sponsors. Maybe try to develop partnerships where there's two-way streets. Think about, Greystone Bakery and Ben & Jerry's, where Greystone Bakery is a nonprofit organization that makes all the brownies that are used in Ben & Jerry's, fudge brownie ice cream. So you're in a situation now where you've got this partnership where both sides of the partnership benefit from the transaction. So you got to start thinking maybe a little bit differently in terms of how you're doing things. And then finally, are you a buyer or a seller? I mean, the economy is going to shrink the marketplace. There are going to be nonprofit organizations that are ultimately not going to survive this. And I'm sorry to say that. And the question now is, you need to look at yourself in the mirror and say, where are we as an organization? Are we an organization that's really built to get through this and to do well? Or are we an organization that's going to have some, ongoing issues and maybe we're not prepared for this, whether that's because of lack of resources, whether that's because lack of leadership, because there's been a lot of people who have been retiring and there might not be that next round of leadership within your organization. So there's a lot of different factors, and you need to really start thinking about things from an organizational perspective. Are you a buyer or a seller in terms of, are you looking to be merged into someone? Or are you going to be the person who's merging others up into you? Another big issue is funding streams. We have the good, the bad, and the jury's still not out on. We had a lot of money coming into nonprofit organizations over the last couple of years. Times were tough. We had a pandemic. But the federal government had multiple bills where they infused a tremendous amount of money into businesses and into the nonprofit sector. It kind of hints back to the ARA days where you had all that ARA funding going into nonprofit organizations to kind of keep the economy going, to keep people employed. Same thing happened here with, under the pandemic. And you had all this CARES Act funding. You had ERTC, you had HHS, you had a child care stabilization, you had shuttered venue, you had all this money being thrown at businesses and nonprofit organizations. You have, in the OPWD world, you have all these bonuses, retention bonuses and everything else for the direct care workers. So you have all this money that's really helped to nonprofits to kind of keep afloat, to keep their staff married to the organization and keep working with the organization. But now you're in a situation where this money's drying up. This money's not going to be there beyond this year. So when we get into the 2024 budget, what is that budget going to look like? Remember, before the pandemic came about, New York State was looking to make certain cuts, all right? And then the pandemic hit and a whole influx of money came in and New York State didn't have to make the cuts. This year, we're in an election year. So because we're in an election year, no one's going to be making cuts this year in an election year because they want to make sure that that money is flowing because they're looking for the votes. 2024 is going to be a different year. 2024, we don't know what 2024 is going to look like. And if we're in a recessionary period and we have a lot of debt sitting out there, there might not be a large amount of money flowing in 2024. So there might need to be some tightening of the belt to go with that tightening economy. So again, things to kind of keep in mind and things to consider as we're moving forward, creating budgets and everything else. We had a large, and that's why that was the bad part. And then the jury's still out. We have this new healthcare worker bonus that's out. You have many reimbursement methodologies that everybody's still sitting back here and saying, well, what is my reimbursement methodology going to look like? What is, we're seeing that there are certain increases, cost of living increases. Are those cost of living increases going to be enough? Are they appropriate? We're looking at some of the government agencies saying, oh yes, you can spend more on your indirect cost rate, but we're not going to give you more total dollars. So all they're doing is shifting dollars around. So again, there's a whole lot of regulatory uncertainty right now in terms of what some of those rates are going to look like, and that's going to be important to kind of figure out. So what do you guys need to do as board members and as an organization? You need to be nimble and cautious in the budget and execution process. So what is my budget going to look like? We talked about that before in terms of contingency budgets and everything else, but really, maybe be a little more conservative in your growth plans and everything else. Stay connected to changing regulations. You need to make sure that you're understanding what the regulations are. And that doesn't mean that you have to attend trade association meetings and stuff like that, but you need to make sure that the individuals who work for the organization are, and that they're reporting back up to you in terms of information so that you have the right information to make those appropriate decisions when they come to you. Need to find ways to get your voice heard above other donors. Remember, donations are probably going to shrink because we're looking at a situation where the market is off, the economy is tough, more people need than have. Provide easier, more flexible giving options, community-centric fundraising. So there's a whole bunch of different components on that fundraising side. And that is a key component of what board members are responsible for doing, is to help keep the finances flowing within an organization, which includes fundraising. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more today, and we'll definitely talk about that a lot more in our third session. We have labor pains. I mean, everybody has labor pains. We're in a situation where, you talk to any employer today and they'll tell you that they can't find staff. Unemployment, as I said before, is down to 3.5%. So there's an increased demand for service with an inability to find and attract employees. And what that's doing is it's putting stress and strain on all of the existing employees that are there. Decrease in company loyalty straight across the board. We're seeing that, people used to go and work for one company and stay there for life. That's not necessarily happening as much. In the nonprofit sector, you do have an advantage. You have an advantage of the fact that, the Gen Z wants to make a social difference, and they are looking for ways and want to be connected with organizations that are really making social change. And as a nonprofit sector, you've got that aspect. So that should be a key selling point when you're talking to potential employees. Diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility is big at all levels, at the organizational level, at the board level, everywhere within the organization. So that's something that's going to continue to be an issue. Staff mental health issues, that's big. There was just something that I heard yesterday that they're going to start doing some testing of children at an early level to see if they have kind of issues with depression and anxiety and things like that. And these are things that are going to be more prevalent. And we're hearing also that burnout is happening at a much earlier age. So, it used to be in the 50s, 60s where you'd start to get work burnout, and that's now kind of moved back down into that 40-year-old range where you're starting to get work burnout. So again, a lot of different issues that are happening here from a labor perspective. We've had a mass exodus out of New York State. People have moved out of New York State, and that's created a shortage. Different labor force today, as I mentioned before, the gig economy and everything else. There's a different way people want to work, and you have to move to that different way. And there's actually been a decline in leadership. I mean, you've got the very, very large organizations who have that multi-level of leadership, but then you have a lot of the smaller organizations who have the upper level management and then really just the low level staff workers, and there's no middle management in there. And that middle management is important because that's where a lot of that succession comes from within an organization. So without that leadership, both at the board and management level, it's kind of tough. So again, what does that mean? So we have to tap into our referral networks and volunteers to try to figure out where we can get the next round of employees. We've seen a lot of instances where our clients have tapped into volunteers to bring them on as full-time workers in order to kind of meet some of those shortfalls they're having, and the volunteers already know the organization and have a love and a connection to the organization. You need to invest in leadership training. That's something that's going to be very, very important. Empathy, communication, feedback, these are all things that, today's workforce is craving. And if you can't deliver it, remember I said before, people aren't connected to employers anymore. People are connected to leaders now. And there's a difference. So we have to kind of make sure that that's all in place. Add flexibility into the staff schedule, provide additional benefits. People are clamoring for daycare, helping them with student loan balances, mental health support. These are all things that, if you can start offering some of these benefits, that'll be helpful. Set barriers between work life and home life. You need to kind of create that separation. That's where those mental health issues, that's where the burnout is happening, because people aren't really separating their work and home lives. Need to develop future leaders, find ways that you can kind of build that middle management and build future leaders so that you have and start working on some succession plan. And again, that succession plan is not just for internal staff, but also board members. Find ways to use more enhanced technology to decrease labor needs. It saves the organization money. And again, when labor is tight, you need to find other ways to do things. And then again, focus on succession plan early. And we'll talk about that in a little while. I know you're probably tired of hearing my voice, so I'm going to turn it over to Tania for a few minutes, and Tania will talk a little bit about board responsibilities. Tania?
Thanks, Ken. So board responsibilities, there's three primary responsibilities for board members. These are the duty of care, loyalty, and obedience. So your duty of care is your legal responsibility for decision-making and exercising your best judgment for the organization. So you have setting the foundation direction for the organization, bringing ideas to the board and voting on matters are helpful with this. Safeguarding assets. Are there internal controls in place that safeguard the organization's assets? Are you aware of the organization's assets? Does the organization have investments? Do they own any property, lease any equipment? Is there proper insurance in place to protect these assets from theft or destruction? Ensure a proper control environment is in place. Be familiar with the internal controls in place at the organization. Are these controls documented? They should be reviewed every few years to see that they're in place, are being carried out the way they're designed. Consider any recommendations for improvements from your auditors. Understand operations and your regulations. So knowing the organizations that you're on the board for, their mission, their different programs, how is the organization funded? Depending on their funding source, they have different regulations to follow. So if they get Medicaid funding, they have to make sure they're compliance with, they have Medicaid compliance, compliance with uniform guidance if you receive federal funding. And then of course, maintaining compliance with New York State corporate law and the Non-for-Profit Revitalization Act as a New York State corporation. And then the last part of duty of care is providing proper fiscal oversight. So understand the organization's financial reporting and filing requirements, review budgets and internal financial information. So
as Tania kind of basically just expressed here, you can kind of get the sense here that in a broad sense, if you think about it, duty of care means the board is responsible for everything required to keep the organization in business. And that doesn't mean that you micromanage, but it just means that you need to get the information you need to be able to make intelligent decisions to keep the organization on track and moving forward.
Duty of loyalty. So that's to act in the best interests of the organization. where you're putting your organization's interests ahead of your own personal or professional interests, especially when making decisions on behalf of the organization. Disclosing any conflicts. The organization must have a conflict of interest policy, and that should be reviewed on an annual basis, signed by your board members, staff, volunteers. This is to potentially disclose any potential conflicts that might not come up through normal discussions throughout the year. Evaluate your executive director and other key members of management. Perform evaluations, review compensation, and see how interactions are between the management and the board. So this is, again, each of these will be discussed in a little bit more detail in later slides. Obedience. This is to ensure the organization is compliant with the laws and regulations and follow its mission. Establishing appropriate policies. Board policies should be established. There's some common ones, such as your conflict of interest policy, whistleblower policy. If you have investments, there should be an investment policy, compensation policy. A lot of these policies are outlined on your 990. So that's open to the public. So, these policies should be in place so that you can answer yes to those questions. Setting appropriate tone at the top. And setting ethical standards, and then provide appropriate governance. So that's kind of a catch-all, overseeing that the organization's management, succession planning, compliance, finances are all in place.
I do want to touch on one thing with respect to policies before we move on. Again, it's the responsibility of the board to set policy, as Tanya mentioned, and to monitor that policies that have been established are properly functioning. That doesn't mean you're going into the organization again. The goal here is not to micromanage, but you want to make sure you're getting appropriate reporting, and it's the board's responsibility to request information needed. If you're not getting what you need to request that information. You should be assessing the information as presented, ask good follow-up questions. So again, all of this comes down to the fact that there should be regular reporting to the board, and the board's getting the information it needs in order to understand what's happening within the organization, so that the board can control the flow, understand where it's going, set the policies that are needed, and then monitor that those policies are being implemented effectively.
So board members are responsible for knowing the organization's mission, programs, the different funding efforts. So for example, if your organization's mission is to offer individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families personal support that promote a high quality of life, result in meaningful outcomes, and foster full participation in their community. So question that you can ask throughout the years, are you staying true to your mission, keeping your organization on track? Your certificate of incorporation, which is part of your governing documents, that includes your mission and your purpose. So the organization must be in compliant with that at all times.
Tanya, before we move on, I want to kind of throw a little story out there. We had a client that we did some work for, and when we looked at their certificate of incorporation, we noted that the certificate of incorporation said that they were an early intervention, or they were set up to provide early intervention services. This was an organization that had been in business for, 30, 40 years. Their main effort was with respect to the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities, so providing services to adults with disabilities. And 5 years before we entered the situation, they wanted to add early intervention services to their certificate of incorporation. And what happened is, when the attorney set that up, he actually changed their certificate of incorporation to be an early intervention provider. So for 5 years, they were actually functioning outside of their certificate of incorporation. That's why that certificate of incorporation is so important. It's important because legally, what it says in your certificate of incorporation is what you're legally allowed to do. So if you want to do something that is outside of what you normally do, you really need to take a look at that certificate of incorporation. You need to look at it and determine if what you're looking to do is an allowable activity for the organization. And if not, you then need to modify the certificate of incorporation to allow the organization to do that. So it's really important to kind of use that mission statement, as Tanya mentioned earlier, a couple seconds ago, and that certificate of incorporation. It's kind of lenses that you kind of look at the organization through. And if you are going to kind of move outside of those, you have to then do something to allow your organization to do it. Sorry, Tanya, go ahead.
No, you're fine. So again, are the decisions you're making help for the organization's mission? Are you deviating away from that mission or purpose or programs? And then again, are you putting your interests ahead of the organization? So again, making those decisions should be, the organization comes first over any personal interest that you may have personally or professionally. Okay. So choosing and evaluating the organization's executive director and CEO. So the board members are responsible for recruiting and hiring an executive director. A job description should be created to outline kind of what the board wants out of an executive director. So as they manage the day-to-day organizations, the job description and who they're looking for should be tailored to that. Evaluate the executive director performance. So how has the executive director performed in his or her role? How often is there communication between the board and the executive director? Making sure that there's interaction and oversight between the two parties is very important to make sure that the organization is continuing, based on how the board is mission, how the board wants to oversee the organization. Annual written performance obligations. So on an annual basis or, shortly after they find a new executive director, just to evaluate how the executive director is performing under the established job description. Were there any performance goals or achievements to accomplish? Have they been met? Are they on track to being met? So just having those meaningful discussions with your executive director on a continuous basis and, every year, just to make sure everyone's on the same page with expectations. Determine and approve an appropriate compensation. So Schedule J to the 990 outlines the policy that's in place of the organization by the board. There's several different options that the board can use to determine compensation of an executive director, and as well as other key members of management. You can develop a compensation committee. You can hire an independent consultant. Use other sources, such as public sources, such as the Form 990 of other similar organizations. Have a written employment contract. You can perform a compensation study or survey. And again, including part of the compensation committee is having the full approval by the board. So those are policies that should be considered when determining compensation of the executive director. It supports the value of the executive director that is reported on the 990. And again, as I said, that's public information. Consider succession planning. That should be developed to achieve, as part of the selection process of new leadership. As there's turnover in high management positions, you want to make sure that there's, a smooth transition from your existing role to your existing leadership to the new leadership, and as well as identifying key positions that will be included in your succession planning and the different job descriptions that you're looking for.
Couple key things here that I kind of just want to touch on real quickly. First of all, we see all the time that executive directors, CEOs, they're not getting formal reviews from the board. There should be, the board should put together an evaluation. The board president should be sitting down with the CEO, or board president, board treasurer, whatever, should be sitting down with the CEO and going through a formalized review with the CEO, so the CEO is getting that proper feedback that they need. But we just don't see it necessarily happening on a regular basis. So it's something that we definitely encourage boards to do. You can't develop and build your leadership unless you're having that active communication about, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, what they need to work on, what is the board expectations and everything else. And if those discussions aren't taking place, there's a breakdown. And the other thing Tania mentioned is succession planning. I find that so many organizations think about succession planning when someone gives notice, and the reality of the situation is you really need to be thinking about succession planning on a regular basis. Do we have someone in-house that we want to develop and grow to be the number 2 within the organization, and that there's a planned succession and everything else? Some of that happens with respect to that performance reviews, having that communication with your executive director, understanding what the executive director's expected life cycle with the organization is going to be. All of those things are extremely important. And then going back to the whole aspect of, when you get to that point, when you're looking for a new executive director, understanding where your organization is, and maybe the executive director you have, or the skill sets of the previous executive director, is not what we're looking for in the new executive director. Organizations go through different life cycles, and early on within an organization, organizations tend to need an executive director who's going to be more regulatory, compliance, understand programs. But then as you get bigger, you hire staff to do that. And now you're looking for an executive director that maybe has different skill sets. So constantly understanding what the skill sets you're looking for from your executive director. Sorry, Tanya, go
ahead. Supporting the CEO. Again, as we've said before, having regular meetings and interaction. It's important to have open communication and communicate often with the executive director. Not just at either monthly or quarterly board meetings. So depending on when your board meetings happen, these communications should be more frequent. Be a resource. It's a shared responsibility. Doesn't all fall on the CEO to, perform carrying out the day-to-day operations and ensuring the mission is and the programs are in the organization's operating smoothly. So the board can help the CEO through different marketing efforts, different networking with potential funders or other nonprofits. So it's a group effort to really bring in different types of sources of funding and making sure that the organization's financially stable, on a go-forward basis. Practice effective planning, review and challenge budgets. So board members are responsible for the approval of the overall agency budget. And this should include side budgets such as, contingency budgets, program specific budgets, and reviewing those, throughout the year, review budget to actual to see how things are on track, or if you need to dive into those contingency budgets. Get involved in strategic planning. There should be established goals that are set for the long-term goals of the organization. That will be carried out by the executive director, and then the board will also monitor the progress of that strategic planning. There's also succession planning that we mentioned before. So as far as outside of change in leadership, the board should be putting a plan together for long-term to help determine the long-term sustainability of the organization. What are the long-term needs, goals? Is there certain funding that needs to be set aside? So it all depends on, the direction that the organization is going in for this, the strategic and the succession planning. The board is responsible for monitoring and strengthen or either eliminate programs and services. So reviewing the effectiveness of each program, is it in line with its mission and not a financial drain? Are there budget reports by program? There should be a review of how expenses are being allocated to different programs to see how successful a program is. If there's several fundraising events or even a fundraising event that the organization has, are the costs of the events worth hosting the event? So reviewing budgets and then the actual costs for these your different programs and the different events to make sure that it's financially makes sense to keep going with them. Collaboration. So collaborate with other organizations. This can provide a huge benefit to both. There's a greater impact when both organizations collaborate together. You know, look for other organizations that have similar missions, similar programs, you know, and they're, you know, working together to further the mission of both organizations, which is a win-win. Merger and acquisition.
We're seeing a little bit more of that in terms of shared back office functions. So we're seeing, you know, some more in order to kind of find ways to cut costs where organizations are starting to share some of those back office responsibilities and back office functions, shared IT services and things like that. And then that collaboration also takes place, as I mentioned before, from a fundraising perspective and everything else, with maybe some of the businesses and maybe developing you know, stronger relationships with businesses in terms of volunteering and everything else. Sorry, Tanya, go ahead.
Merger and acquisition. Are you a buyer or seller? You know, like Ken said before, in this economy and how the state of where some of our nonprofits are, is it worth looking into merging with another organization or acquiring another organization? You know, see what kind of nonprofits out there that are similar in with your mission. Perform your due diligence to see if this is an option. And when two organizations come together, it really just helps to strengthen the two organizations to greater your mission. Ensure appropriate financial resources, maintain proper fiscal oversight. So ensuring there's proper financial controls. Are there policies in place? Are there internal controls in place, you know, that are being carried out by the executive director, by program staff, by volunteers, just making sure that things are being reviewed and carried out properly. Perform, review financial analysis and understand trends. This is something that should be reviewed throughout the year. Look at trends that are meaningful for the organization, that help make informed decisions. Understand the financial strengths and needs of the organization. Is there any large capital improvements that need to be purchased down the road? Making sure there's funds set aside for that. Do we need to tap into new types of different funding sources? You know, looking into new donors. And then also meeting with your external auditors. So this is done at least 2 times a year, you know, to go over your audit plan. And then this also gives the board a chance to voice any concerns or areas that they would like the auditor to look into during the audit. And then the second meeting is going over the results of the audit. So reviewing the financial statements, reviewing if there's any recommendations for improvements, and then taking those recommendations and implementing them, you know, into the organization. Designate funds when necessary. So establishing reserves, establishing a board endowment. This can help provide, you know, steady cash flow for the organization to run, you know, certain operations in the time of if there's any cash flow issues.
No, it's helping to earmark funds for so that everybody understands that those funds are earmarked for some specific purpose or earmarked for future growth or future reserves in case there is a dip in the economy like we're experiencing now. So it's really, you know, when you're looking at designated funds, it's really looking at ways that an organization can really start to, or as a board can really start to look at the fiscal strength of an organization and decide how some of those fiscal reserves are going to be effectively used.
And then lastly is to help raise funds for the organization. So as a board member, you have the ability to market the organization to your own contacts, your own professional network. You can donate yourself to the organization or solicit donations. You can have a give or get policy that board members need to provide, you know, a certain amount of funding every year. And then, of course, be an advocate for the organization. So bring in awareness to your community, and that could in turn generate funding from, individual donors or corporations.
Tanya mentioned give or get. I actually prefer give and get. I'm a firm believer in, board members should give to the organization and look to help support the organization through getting other people they know to give. Because if you're just trying to get, that doesn't necessarily work, because if you're not willing to give your own money to an organization, then, there's an issue there. And then the other thing Tanya had mentioned, she had mentioned that, meeting with the external auditors. We meet with our clients on a regular basis throughout the year. So like if we sit down with our boards after the audit is over, one of the things that we find is a lot of times we get crammed into a board meeting, where we're given 15 minutes or 20 minutes to do a presentation. I don't think that's enough time. I think really that the board, or if you're going to have an audit committee or finance committee, there should be more time spent on that annual audit and gaining insight into, what's going on within the organization. And there should be a good dialogue and discussion. It shouldn't just be, here's a 10-minute presentation taking you through some numbers and that's it. It's really the one time you have to sit with your external auditors to really talk about some of the things that they're seeing within the industry. Hopefully you're working with a firm that has a broad base of knowledge about the nonprofit sector, and you can kind of use that and find out, what they're seeing in terms of other clients that they have and what's happening within the industry and where things are going from a regulatory perspective. So you really want to try to utilize that time you have with your external auditors effectively. So to try to cram it into 15 minutes or 20 minutes isn't always the best answer.
Another responsibility is to develop new board members. So existing board members should help develop and cultivate new board members. As board members' terms come to an end, there's always a need for new board members. Or if you're looking to grow your board, there should be some kind of policies in place and procedures to help fit this need. So the board members should first determine the different qualities that you want in a board member. All of your desires of furthering the mission of the organization should be aligned. You have the ability to reach out to get potential candidates, either through LinkedIn, it can go on your website, or through word of mouth. And then when you do have potential candidates, you can ask certain questions to make sure that they are a good fit to serve on the board. So finding out what their different level of commitments are going to be, how knowledgeable they are of the organization, its mission and programs, as well as overall knowledge of the not-for-profit industry in general. Do they have any access to resources? What is their professional background? How they can be a resource, whether they're, a former, banker, CPA, attorney, and of course, most importantly, why do they want to join? So potential board members looking to join a board are usually there because they are engaged in the organization as far as, having a passion for their mission and want to be able to help further that organization. Orient and mentor new board members and evaluate the performance of these board members. So are board members present at meetings? Are they engaged in discussions? How involved are they, outside of board meetings? Are they part of any board committees? Are they bringing different types of funding to the organization? How are their contacts? So hiring, mentoring, and evaluating is an important role for the existing board of directors. Ensure legal and ethical integrity. The three primary board responsibilities: care, loyalty, and obedience. Your actions on setting up these responsibilities help move forward the organizational goals. The board members should be knowledgeable about the organization, its operations, its funding, industry, and its regulations. So again, everything about the organization, the board members should be familiar with, because that helps them carry out their responsibility. They need to adhere to legal standards and ethical forms. So setting that tone at the top and establish effective policies and procedures. Are there any procedures that need to be updated? Again, review these existing board procedures. Maybe they need to have, you know, revamping of your current policies. And then appropriately deal with conflicts. So there's a conflict of interest policy that should be followed. If there is conflicts, identified conflicts of interest, you know, just follow that policy, making sure that there's proper voting at the board level, that the transactions in arm's length, and that everything is properly documented in the board minutes. Understanding your legal and compliance concerns. So the Nonprofit Revitalization Act, that was from 2014, and that was an overhaul of how nonprofits governed in New York State. So that sets standard for annual filing requirements, interactions with your external auditors, and mandatory board policies, such as that conflict of interest policy and your whistleblower policy. NITMIFA, the organization has investments or assets that are used in that capacity. NITMIFA is, you know, prudent spending of those investments, monitoring your endowment activity, and establishing investment policy. Organizational compliance. So again, depending on the different funding that the organization has, they have to make sure they're compliant with those funding sources. So such as Medicaid funding with Office of Medicaid Inspector General, New York State Comptroller, if you have different, you know, federal funding, and you know, filing requirements as well. So if you have Medicaid funding, making sure that you're filing your consolidated fiscal report every year, having that compliance audit if you receive government funding. And then lastly is your pension compliance. So if the organization has a 401k plan, 403b plan, defined benefit plan, you know, making sure that the timely filings of the 5500 are being done. The plan document, that should be up to date with any new laws and regulations addressing any known compliance issues. So a good way to help the board know that they're in compliance and review this part of, you know, review the pension compliance is hiring a third-party administrator. They can be helpful with making sure everything's up to date, that your filings of the 5500 are being done. But of course, the board still has to hold that third party accountable throughout that process. So your board responsibilities also include enhancing the organization's public standing. So you're an ambassador for the agency, lobbying to the public sector and fundraising from the private sector. Promoting the organization is important. So reaching out to your network, to your contacts, using social media, LinkedIn to help, you know, to advocate for the organization and bring awareness to the organization. Building a network of resources and future board committee members, and then understanding what the organization does and issues facing the organization and the not-for-profit sector.
So, I mean, one of the things you can see here is that, you know, there's a lot of responsibilities, and in terms of kind of helping the organization. If you don't understand what the organization does, you don't have a background in terms of what are the issues that the organization is dealing with from a fiscal perspective, from a regulatory perspective. So if you're not really up on all of this stuff, how can you really be a good ambassador? How can you really advocate for the organization? You know, so it really, all of these things build on each other. All of these things are interrelated to each other. It's really, really important that you have all of these pieces working in order to be effective. In addition, you know, Tanya mentioned, you know, again, being that ambassador for the organization. Part of that also includes maybe utilizing some of the political clout you may have. So if I'm in a situation where I have relationships with politicians or legislators or anything like that, that might be important when it comes to a need for a regulatory situation, or maybe a governmental agency is holding back funding and I'm not getting the funding that I need. So how do I kind of utilize some of the other resources that I have as a board member in terms of relationships and stuff like that to kind of help the organization move forward? So the board members, I mean, when you step onto a board, you are taking on a lot of different responsibilities through that. So it's really important that you understand the time commitment that's going to go into this. It's really important to understand, what the organization's expectations are and everything else. Because if you're really going to join a board because, your friend asked you to or something like that, but you're not going to take it seriously, you're not really doing an effective job for the organization that you're working with. And the organization is counting on you. They're counting on you for many reasons. They're counting on you for fiscal support. They're counting on you for your intellectual background and the ability for you to come up with ideas and ask the right questions and all of those things. So it really, really, really is important that if you're going to take on the responsibility of a board, that you do it. We see so often that board members show up at board meetings, they interact during the board meeting, they leave, and time stops, and they do nothing for the next month or next 2 months or quarter, whatever, until the next board meeting happens. And then they just dive in and kind of deal with the next board meeting. And that's not the way it's supposed to work. There needs to be that interaction, that flow in between. You need to be constantly abreast of what's happening within the organization. You should be doing strategic planning once a year at least. There should be a committee structure. And we'll talk about all of that right now in terms of that whole aspect of building a stronger board. So if you're going to think about it, build a stronger board, and that's really what we're all trying to accomplish here, because you build a strong nonprofit by building strong nonprofit leadership, and leadership starts with the board of directors. That is really the ultimate top point of everything, is the board of directors. They're the ones who are tasked with providing the, as Tanya mentioned before, the tone at the top. They're the ones who are tasked at really providing direction for the organization, and they're the North Star in essence for the organization, to make sure that the organization is keeping on track to its mission and everything else. One of the things that I tell my boards when I'm talking to them is one of the things you should do at all times is always keep that mission of the organization in front of you. Have it someplace when you're sitting at a board meeting or when you're dealing with the organization's activities. Have that mission in front of you, so that when you're making decisions and you're going through, the governance of the organization, you really truly understand why you're there. You truly understand, what is at stake if you don't do what you're supposed to be doing, that mission, and use that as, again, your guiding light in terms of what you're going to do. So in order to be an effective board member, and in order to build that, stronger board, you really need to understand the organization's needs. And that comes at many different levels. So, if I'm looking at that board and I'm trying to understand, okay, I want to build a stronger board, right? So what do I need at that board level in order to do it? And for most places or most organizations, one of the biggest challenges they have is, how do I find new board members? How do I get the board members, the right board members in here? How do I, get the board members that are going to help effectively drive this organization forward? And everybody's looking for those same board members. And honestly, everybody's tapping those same board members. Everybody's kind of reaching out and trying to get those people on their boards. So when you're looking at bringing on board members, I think the most important, or one of the most important things, is really understand what it is you're looking for. What is it you need? You don't want a board, unless you're an organization that's dealing with, legal matters. You don't want a board with 27 attorneys on it. You want to have a good cross section of that board. So you want to look at the background of the current board members. You want to understand what backgrounds they have, and what's missing. Where are the holes on your board? Who are the people that I need to bring on with the right backgrounds that are going to help kind of move this organization forward? Consider area that you serve. And what are do I have board members who understand my constituents, who look like my constituents? That's going to be important. So, the whole DEIA component of things, the whole socioeconomic component of things, people who are on the ground, who understand the communities that you're serving. It's important. It's not, You don't always need to have board members who are able to bring in the dollars. It's also important to have people on the board who can tell the stories and can provide insight and assist in some of that decision-making process. Consider, as I mentioned, all of these, consider experience. So if I'm dealing with an organization that is, let's say maybe a Make-A-Wish Foundation who's granting wishes to children, it might make sense to have as a board member a wish family, someone from a wish family who's gone through that experience, who understands the experience, who understands some of the challenges that are being faced, so that when you're setting policy and when you're making decisions, you've got some input from someone who really gets your organization, who understands how your organization operates and understands the mindset of the individuals that you're serving. So again, kind of consider all of those factors in terms of building your board. You know, I find it also kind of funny that, you know, I'll bring someone to a board and I'll say, hey, this would be a good board member for you. And the board takes a vote and they bring the person on. Well, they don't really know the person. They're kind of accepting that person because I said that they would make a good board member. There's a lot of times we don't see a formalized interview process. We interview staff before we hire them. We interviewed our executive director before we hired them. Yet here we are at the ultimate leadership, your board. And we're not always doing a good job of interviewing them to make sure that they are the good fit for the organization. And we'll talk about in a second some of the board committees, but that's kind of what I like about board committees, is the fact that the committee structure allows you to test out your board members, giving them kind of almost like an internship where they can function on a committee first, see how they function on a committee, see what their ability is, see how devoted they are to the organization, what sort of time commitment can they give, and everything else. And you kind of get all of that understanding in that committee structure before you bring them up into a board position. The other thing that really needs to happen is you need to have a good onboarding process. I mean, if someone's going to come on the board, you need to give them information. They need to get a whole pool of information. They should have board minutes from the last couple of years. They should have access to your governance documents, as Tanya mentioned before, your bylaws, your certificate of incorporation. All of those things are things that they should have access to. They should have access to financial information so they get an understanding of what the budget looks like and everything else. So again, there should be a whole package and an onboarding process that takes place. I'm a firm believer in having a place where all of that stuff is stored to make it easy for board members, whether that's on in Teams, you have a board Teams site and you put it there, or you have a Google Doc, or you use an outside program like Bell's Board or whatever it is. But there should be one place where all of these documents are stored. And this way the board members can go there, see what those documents are. And that's really good, again, for a new board member. And then I would also say that it would be great to have a board mentor. So assign to each new board member that's coming onto the board, an existing board member who's already been there and done that. So this way they have someone they can bounce questions off of, ask things to, and they don't feel like they're kind of out there, as a board member without really having a support system. So again, I think all of those things are important. I mentioned before board committees, and Tanya mentioned this earlier also, but the board committees are important because they streamline the board meeting, because a lot of the business can happen at the committee level and then be brought to the board for either approval or reporting. So it's really important to have the committee structure for that way. For that reason. In addition, as I mentioned before, it's a potential farm system for your board. There are two main types of committees. There's the committee of the organization and the committee of the board. The committee of the board is made up of board members. The committee of the organization has outside members on the committee. Committee of the board can bind the organization. The committee of the organization cannot, because you do have those outside members. So the committee of the organization typically makes recommendations to the board, and the board is the one who then makes those ultimate decisions. That could happen at the committee of the board level too, but a lot of times the committee of the board can make decisions. Some of the key committees that we see out there is Finance Committee, Compensation Committee, which Tanya had mentioned in terms of developing compensation for key members of management. Audit Committee, that's a very important committee. Every organization who requires a review or an audit should have an audit committee. It's also the only committee that is specifically defined within the Nonprofit Revitalization Act. So again, if you have an audit committee, please go to the Nonprofit Revitalization Act, read about it, and make sure that you're meeting the criteria within that. A nominating committee to basically be able to bring together potential board members. That's where a lot of that board interview process can take place. A compliance committee to make sure that, and this is one that's typically a committee of the organization where you have some of the internal staff on the compliance committee, as well as board members, to kind of go through some of the compliance issues, because again, a key factor, and we'll talk about this, I think it's in our next presentation, but a key factor that the board needs to think about is risk. And Tanya did talk about that with respect to the safeguarding of assets, but risk goes well beyond insurance. It goes into many other components of things. So you really, when a board is looking at things, it's not just, are we operating effectively organizationally? Do we have the right resources fiscally? But are we in compliance with all the rules and regulations that we're required to have in place? So that compliance committee is important. A board governance committee, again, making sure that things like bylaws and everything else are functioning the way you're supposed to, that those are being looked at on a periodic basis, and that we're functioning with respect to those, that policy and procedure manuals are updated and everything else. Development committee, if you want to pull together some of your board members to help with the development of the organization, help with fundraising and things like that. And then also maybe a program committee. So a committee that kind of focuses and looks at some of the programmatic aspects of what's happening within the organization. Moving on, one of the big places where boards break down is in the meetings themselves. I've seen board meetings that go on for 3-4 hours. It's hard for anybody to stay kind of interested or engaged for an extended period of time. You want to shrink those board meetings down. You want to try to find ways to make those board meetings effective, where it's a discussion, it's a figuring out where the organization is going from a strategic perspective, dealing with issues and ratifying or doing the votes and stuff on new business that needs to be dealt with. So how do you make those meetings more effective? How do you get them down to under 2 hours? I mean, honestly, an ideal meeting would be an hour to hour and a half. So how do you get there? Well, think about things like ensuring that the board has all of the information long before the meeting takes place. So you want to make sure the board has all of the information at least 3 days, 4 days before, so that the board can review this. They can go through everything, make sure they understand everything, read through all of the materials, and be prepared then to have an intelligent, quick conversation about things. Consider consent agendas, where the board resolutions are already laid out within the consent agenda, so that all the resolutions are there. The board can just read through those resolutions and they just vote on the entire consent agenda and say, okay, there are 5 resolutions in there. We've read it. We all agree to them. And yes, all 5 of those are ratified and it's done. So it kind of streamlines a lot of that process. And that can only happen again with getting the board information long before the meeting takes place. Prioritize tasks. Focus on the important things. It's amazing how, I've sat through board meetings where, they're talking about the color of the linen at a fundraising event. That is not a board function. That's not something that should be discussed at a board level. We should be talking about really the high level, high impact issues. Everything else can be pushed down into committees, where committees then can go through, make decisions. Any recommendations they have would get thrown up onto either a consent agenda or a committee report. Those committee reports should be sent out to the board members beforehand so they can read them and understand what's happening, and then just be available to ask questions about each of the committees as we go through it. And that'll help to streamline the board meetings. It'll help to focus those board meetings on the important issues that need to be focused on, and push other things down into some of the committee structure where it belongs. I'm a big proponent on board agreements. You know, if you have a board meeting, a board member who's looking to come on, you know, how do you ensure that that board member is going to be effective? How do you ensure that they understand what their responsibilities and everything are? So if I have a board agreement which outlines the responsibilities on both sides, what are my responsibilities to you as a board member? What are your responsibilities to us as a board member? And it's a contract between the two, and the board member signs it. In there, you talk about terms and term limits and responsibilities and committee structure and give get, and all of that stuff is built right into that board agreement. So once the board member signs that, you know, they understand what it is that is expected of them, and they're going to be much more likely to comply and be a good board member because they've put their name to something and they've agreed to it and said, yes, I will do this. And if they're not a good board member, it's a very easy thing to get them off the board because they've agreed to something and they've not complied with the contract or agreement they've put in place. As I mentioned before, access to good open communication and dialogue. All of that stuff should be on some sort of platform. You know, again, conflict of interest policies, budgets, tax filings, certificate of incorporation, all that stuff should be in one place so that board members can find it readily. There really should be some board retreats and education. As I said, I'm a big fan of having that at least once a year, where you get a chance to bring the board together. That could be a longer meeting. That could be, you know, 4 hours, 6 hours, whatever it is, a whole day. And that's where you're dealing with things like strategic planning, strategic direction. That's where you get into those questions. Are we a buyer or a seller? Merger acquisition, what are we looking at? Where's our direction? What is our goals for the next year? All of those things can take place at that strategic planning meeting. I think what we found over the last couple of years under COVID is that we've gotten into crisis management mode, and we need to get out of crisis management mode and think more strategically. And that, again, starts with the board. Spend time connecting to the programs. If you're not connected to the programs, you're not going to be as passionate. So you want to add purpose to the process here. That can happen through bringing a program person in or a constituent in, talking about, you know, what the organization has done for them or what some of the programs are doing for others. It helps to energize the board. It helps to remind the board why they're there, okay, in the room. It helps to connect the organization to the mission, because the mission is a bunch of words on a page, which is important. But if you can see the good things that are happening, whether it be a video, whether it be a person coming and talking at the event or at the board meeting or whatever, you want to have that connection and that connectivity. And again, I think if you can have that connectivity, it helps to build a stronger board. And then one of the things I've seen that's been effective in certain boards is boards have hired coaches or hired counsel, where they have an attorney or someone who attends board meetings, who helps push things along, who helps to drive the discussion, who helps to ensure that things stay on task. Now, I know that's the job of the board president, but again, a lot of times people are doing this on a voluntary basis. So to have someone who is getting paid, who understands all of this, and who can kind of help direct some of the discussion or help to ensure that the board is doing what they're supposed to do, who knows the rules and everything else, I think that could be helpful in terms of building a stronger board. We always get asked questions about board structure. How big should a board be? Well, that's really up to each organization, but you got to kind of find that right balance. If your organization is too small, you might not have enough expertise within the board to help you in terms of making appropriate decisions or driving conversation. Remember, you don't know what you don't know. So the more people you have, the more likelihood is that there won't be things that slip through cracks. The other thing, if your board is too small, if a couple people don't show up, you don't have a quorum. So you might constantly be in a situation where no business can get done because you don't have a quorum. The other thing, though, is if your board is too large, things can get out of control. You might not be able to get business done because there's too many people in a room and they just can't come to a consensus. So you need to find that number that kind of works for you as an organization. Is it 10? Is it 12? Is it 15? Again, I can't answer that question. That's going to be something that's going to be, personal to each organization. But again, that is going to be something that's important. Again, 3 is probably too few. 5 is maybe too few. You want to be somewhere over that. 30 is probably too many. So you want to be somewhere in that range. So bigger than bread box, smaller than a house. There are different types of organizational structures. You have membership organizations and non-membership organizations. It's important to understand what type of organization you have. And if you are a membership organization, what rights do the membership have? What is it they're supposed to be voting on and everything else? Because we've seen, again, a lot of instances where, you know, you have membership organizations, but we're not following the membership regulations that are in the, you know, the governing documents. So it's really important to understand some of those types of things. But, you know, are you a membership or you're a non-membership? What rights are you going to give to your members versus not? And you have 501c3 organizations, not just C6s and C4s that are membership organizations. Governing documents are important. Again, remember, your bylaws are basically how you set yourself up to operate and run. So that those bylaws need to make sense. Those bylaws need to be in accordance with the law, first of all. We've seen instances where bylaws are not in accordance with the Nonprofit Revitalization Act, or they haven't been updated. The Nonprofit Revitalization Act's been around for, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years, maybe longer. They haven't been updated since the Nonprofit Revitalization Act came into play. So you really want to make sure that those bylaws are up to date and that they make sense and they're reflective of both law and how the organization operates. We talked about certificate of incorporation. We talked about the importance of having that certificate of incorporation in place and making sure that you're following it. And if there are any modifications to your operations, that the certificate equally gets modified. Tanya kind of went through a lot of the board policies, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But just understand that there's a bunch of different types of policies that you want to make sure that as a board you're putting in place, and those are governance policies in terms of how you operate, how you govern things like conflicts of interest and things like that, to kind of help you through those three duties: duty of loyalty, duty of obedience, and duty of care. There's administrative policies, like how are things, how cost allocations and stuff like that. Some of those administrative policies are set by the organization management and not necessarily set by the board. And that's fine. But again, some of those, it's still important to understand what some of those policies are and whether those policies are effective and make sense. You've got personnel policies, which are outlined within your employee handbook. You've got operational policies that may be outlined in a policy and procedure handbook. You've got IT policies, which govern things like today. There's so many more issues with respect to cybersecurity and everything else. So you need to make sure that those IT policies are good and in place and make sense. And then Tanya mentioned before, she discussed NMIFA, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next couple minutes. But making sure that we've got in place correct investment and spending policies. NMIFA is a law that's been on the books for probably about 13, 14 years now, which really spell out, you know, that you have to have in place certain investment policies and spending policies if you have investments and if you have an endowment. And again, we'll spend a couple minutes talking about that now. So NMIFA comes from the UPMIFA, which is the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, which is a federal guideline. And then each state was asked to set up their own policies under UPMIFA, and New York State set up theirs, which is the New York Prudent Management of Investment Funds Act. So, you know, if you're not, and again, everybody on this call may not be a New York State nonprofit. So you should look to the relevant state guidance with respect to the regulations. It governs the management, as I said before, of investments and funds held by nonprofit organizations. It provides information on endowments, endowment spending. It really comes down to, from an endowment perspective, the donor intent is not clear from the donor contribution or letter. So if the donor says you must hold this money in perpetuity, that's pretty clear. I have to hold the money in perpetuity. I can't use it. I can't invade the corpus. But if the owner is silent in terms of the use of those, or not the use, but the ability to utilize those funds, and they don't say that the funds must be maintained in its entirety in perpetuity or whatever, then it really comes down to the board to make a decision as to whether the board is going to establish a policy where they keep the endowment intact, or whether they establish a policy where they allow the organization to invade the corpus, and that's all spelled out within NITMIFA. So really quick, if an organization has investments, and investments is a broadly defined term, it could be stocks, bonds, whatever, but it could also be cash. I could have a bunch of money sitting in money markets or in laddered CDs or whatever. But if I have investments within the organization, I need to go through a process. There needs to be, and this often happens at the finance committee, but there needs to be a process where you go through 8 steps, and you have to look at the investments to ensure that your investment policy and how you're investing the funds is prudent. So if I've got a bunch of mutual funds, and you happen to be invested in, of the 10 mutual funds, you happen to be invested in 3 of the mutual funds that you picked are the worst performing mutual funds within their category, and you're not looking at it, and you're not analyzing it, and you're not determining whether those are still appropriate investments for your organization, you're in a situation where you're not being prudent. And when you look at prudency isn't just, we have to make sure that we're not being aggressive. You could be imprudent if you're being too conservative too. So you really have to look at your investment options. You have to review them with an eye towards these 8 items that are on the board or on the screen. And you have to really determine if you're doing the right job from an investment perspective. So again, that's why, when we talk about risk, we talk about compliance, and we talk about bringing other people into board meetings or into committee meetings to have discussions. This is where it'd be good to have your investment advisor coming in, if you have an investment advisor who's reviewing things and who's able to look at each of the investments and determine if those investments are appropriate, and help the board to understand if they are or aren't. So again, some of the factors that you need to consider are outlined here. Funds should be diversified unless the institution prudently determines that because of special circumstances, the purpose of the funds are better served not diversified. So again, we're in a weird stock market right now, right? The market's down. The market's been underperforming. It's taken a big hit. So if you liquidated your stock portfolio before this all thing hit, and you have all the money sitting in cash, that might be a prudent thing today, is to have the money sitting in some level of cash or cash investments while you're waiting to understand the direction of the economy, while you're waiting to understand the direction of the market and everything else. So again, these are all things that you need to consider and there should be a discussion outlined within either a committee or a board meeting, and there should be an affirmative statement that the investments that are in place within the organization have been reviewed in accordance with NITMIFA, and but the board believes that they are prudent for the needs of the organization in the context of NITMIFA. If your organization happens to have endowments, then there's another section of NITMIFA, as we talked about, is the endowment section. Understand that there are 2 types of endowments you can have. You can have, as Tanya mentioned, the board can set money aside, and you can have what's a quasi-endowment, where the board kind of designates certain funds to be used for a particular purpose. Or you could have a true endowment, which is donor restricted assets. The only person who can restrict an asset is a donor. So you can have that kind of cross between the 2. Endowments remain restricted until either appropriated or for expenditure. So there's 2 things that a board can do. They can either choose to accumulate the funds, or they can appropriate the funds for expenditure. And that's something that the board has to evaluate on an annual basis, and it needs to be documented within the board. If the board does not appropriate for expenditure, the funds automatically get accumulated. So if you think you're utilizing these funds and you've never had a conversation that says you're going to release the funds for expenditure, those funds can't be released. That's part of the law. So you really have to go through and make sure that if you have endowments, you're going through this process. It's extremely important. And again, if you have funds that have been appropriated, you don't have to expend them right away. They just cease to be permanently restricted, and they become, under the old terminology, temporarily restricted. And in deciding whether to appropriate from the endowment or accumulate, you have to go through, again, a series of questions, and this all has to be documented. This is one of the things that has to be documented within the either the board minutes or some sort of analysis or discussion, but it has to be ratified by the board. So again, something that you need to think about and look at, and these are the questions you have to go through. We're kind of running out of time. So, and then, as I said, organizations must make a contemporaneous record of its considerations of the factors, should be detailed and address each of the factors. Separate assessment should be made for each fund or endowment. So if I have multiple endowments, I have to do this for every single one of the individual endowments I have. There's a rebuttable presumption that I cannot spend more than 7%. So even if I wanted to do more than 7, I couldn't. That's the most I can invade a corpus by is 7. Most people use either an average of the last few years with a cap at 5% or something like that. And I think that's it. We have some additional resources. I mentioned that at the beginning. Whoa, what just happened there? I mentioned at the beginning, so we have the nonprofit guide for effective board membership. It's on our website. We have an IT guidebook, which looks at cybersecurity issues and controls. These are the main partners within our nonprofit group with our contact information. Feel free to reach out to any one of us with questions that you may have. That's what we're here for. And then again, as I mentioned, December 13th is part 2 and January 19th is part 3. We're running out of time. We will take questions if anybody has any questions. We appreciate all of your patience and staying with us for an hour and a half. I know an hour and a half is a long time. But thank you, everybody, for being part of this. Hopefully you got something out of it. And again, feel free to reach out to any one of us. We're more than happy to help. That's what we're here for. Thank you.
Thank you.